Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, Professor of Brazilian History and Culture at Brown University and the National Co-Coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure to speak with Jana Silverman. Jana holds a Ph.D. in labor economics from the Universidade Estadual de Campinas and is a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Global Workers' Rights at Penn State University. She is also a research fellow at the Washington, Brazil office. She is also a researcher with the Center for Trade Union Studies and the Economy of Labor at the Economics Institute of the State University of Campinas. Her research interests include Latin American labor relation regimes, contemporary Brazilian political economy, and domestic workers. In addition, she is co-chair of the Americas Subcommittee of the Democratic Socialists of America International Committee. Previously, she was a program director for Brazil of the AFL-CIO Solidarity Center in Sao Paulo from 2012 to 2020. Welcome, Jana, to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thanks, Jim. It's so great to be here. Looking forward to this conversation.
So, Jana, tell us, first of all, how did you get involved in Brazil?
Okay, so it's a bit of a long story. So I've been doing kind of Latin America solidarity work for now, I want to say 2.5 decades. I was a labor activist, a rank and file labor activist, then a shop steward in New York with UAW back as one of my first jobs after I finished my undergrad degree. I was always very interested in labor. I come out of a labor family. I was always a labor activist, also have been very inclined to socialist politics. And I, through meeting other folks, other activists in New York, Latino activists, I found out that, unionists in other countries, including Colombia and Brazil, Guatemala, have been heavily persecuted for things that, in the United States, I did with, without worrying about, threats to my lives. But, the maximum that could happen, obviously, as a labor activist in the United States is basically you can get fired. But anyway, I found out about, we got involved in activism first with the Colombian trade union movement. I moved to Medellin and worked for 5 years as a labor researcher with an institute that's linked to the primary union confederation of Colombia, also called the CUT. During that time as a researcher, I got involved with a Pan-Latin American project that researched the labor impacts of certain multinational enterprises. And the organization that was leading that project was the Instituto Observatorio Social of the CUT Brazil. So it was, I want to say it was the end of 2005. I went to Sao Paulo for the first time and I just fell in love. I met so many great friends that I'm still friends with today. Just really, absolutely was intrigued by sort of the whole political process that was happening at the time with, this was the first Lula government, seeing the labor movement have real power, being able to influence national politics, which is something obviously I didn't see in Colombia, all to the contrary. Trade unions were getting assassinated in Colombia at the same time. And even we didn't see that, or we don't see that even today that much in the United States. So became really fascinated, made some very deep friendships and just learned Portuguese. And when it came time to, when I wanted to make a bit of a career shift and decided I wanted to go do a PhD and wanted to do it in labor economics, I decided since I was going to study Latin America and study the Brazilian labor movement, what better place to do it than to go and do it in Brazil at the University of Campinas, which has a very well-known sort of heterodox labor economics program. So I went there, and after finishing my degree, I basically just stayed. I was lucky enough to find a job there and would hope to be able to move back there soon.
And you have a son who's a Brazilian American, is that right?
Yeah, my son, I have a 5.5-year-old. He was born in Sao Paulo, in Vila Mariana. His dad is actually from Volta Redonda, Rio de Janeiro, but we met him in Sao Paulo. And so he's got 2 passports, and I'm still happy to have my Brazilian permanent residence. So I definitely feel partially Brazilian myself.
So what's the state of the labor movement in Brazil today?
Well, the labor movement in Brazil has been going through some very difficult times that didn't necessarily begin just with Bolsonaro. Obviously, it went through sort of its heyday. Its first heyday was back in the early to mid 80s, where You had the Novo Sindicalismo movement, which was the new form of unionism that was anti-corporativist, that believed in freedom of association, more rank and file oriented, which Lula came out of. He's the most sort of well-known figure. And then after fighting off a series of neoliberal reforms under Fernando Henrique Cardoso in the 90s, obviously with the PT governments, the union movement was afforded a lot of new spaces. They participated in a lot of, multi-partite consejos on social policy, on labor policy. There was massive increases in the real minimum wage. There was very important legislation which dramatically increased rights for domestic workers. So it was obviously it was a good moment for labor, but at the same time, sort of my criticism is that they didn't use that time as much as they probably could have in terms of to increase their actual membership, to build stronger links with their rank and file. And so when you start to see these attacks coming from the right wing, as there's an economic downturn starting in 2014 or so, they basically, because of the lack of these connections with a lot of rank and file members and with the Brazilian working class in general, they weren't able to mobilize a substantial number of Brazilian workers to defend the gains under the PT governance. And that's what we saw the coup in 2016. And the coup against the constitutional coup against Dilma Rousseff, which, obviously one of the main reasons for the elites was to implement the neoliberal economic policies. And one of the first, and I would say one of the most harshest, was the labor law reform of 2017, which introduced a huge number of new forms of precarious contracting, which reduced labor rights, reduced union rights in terms of the role unions play in monitoring workers' contracts. And perhaps most importantly for the labor movement, they lost their primary source of financing, which was the labor union tax, which every formal sector worker in Brazil used to pay 1 day's worth of salary per year to unions. And that was their form of financing. And so they lost that. And then basically since then, they've been really struggling to find new forms of financing. And then obviously having Lula in prison for almost 2 years, kind of gave them a loss of social and political legitimacy because Lula is so identified with the labor movement. And, again, the whole spiral of fake news. I'm sure many of your other guests have talked about, the whole impact of the 2018 elections, but that was felt very deeply by labor. And since then, obviously then after, Bolsonaro coming to power, you have him trying to take a series of other measures through medidas provisorias or like, presidential decrees to make it even more difficult for labor to organize, such as not allowing unions anymore to do dues checkoff. Also basically have employers take out dues money from members directly from paychecks. There was a space about 3 months where actually anybody who wanted to pay dues to the unions actually had to do it through depositing money in a bank account. Which is obviously very difficult. Many people, as much as they may be union supporters, will not go out of their way to do something like that. And then obviously when the pandemic came, there was a whole nother slew of presidential decrees that Bolsonaro made to limit collective bargaining, to flexibilize work contracts even more, using the pandemic as a pretext. Luckily, many of these medidas provisorias have not stood. They were not voted on favorably afterwards by the Congress. But we're still back at, not back at square one, but we're still at this sort of negative square one, which is the labor movement post-labor law reform 2017. So I guess that would be kind of the short version.
So what's at stake in the 2022 elections for labor?
A lot, absolutely a lot. Again, there's definitely a hope that some of these worst provisions of the labor law reform, which allow for example, 0-hour contracts, which are a very extreme form of part-time contracts where workers get contracted, but they are guaranteed that they're not guaranteed they'll get any actual hours to work. So they're not guaranteed to make a minimum wage.
Wait a minute. I want to understand that. Why does that happen? An employer wants to guarantee a person is at their beck and call when they might need them?
Exactly. And this is actually a contract, it's not that dissimilar, from the way many part-time contracts work in the United States. You get your many part-time contracts, you're hired but not with any sort of fixed number of hours per se. And this is something we're seeing playing out, it's kind of a parenthesis with the Starbucks workers in the United States, which are organizing. Many of the key organizers, they shouldn't get fired because that's against US labor law, but what the company is doing them is giving them little to no hours. But there's a kind of contract now in Brazil that functions like that. Unions are hoping to overturn that. They're basically hoping to, get a seat at the table again. For obvious reasons, Bolsonaro has no channels of negotiation with the unions at all. They've been persecuted, especially rural unions. There's been cases of assassinations of union leaders since 2018. So again, it's really a question of this election will really depend on their sort of physical and political existence.
So in the past, during the dictatorship, when it was finally allowed for there to be national labor federations that existed, two major ones came to be. One of them was the Central Unified Central Unity, or how is CUCI translated into English? I'm trying to remember.
Unified Workers Central, maybe.
Yeah, and which was the one that was affiliated with the Workers' Party, and there was another large confederation. And over the years, there are, I think, now 7 national confederations. My understanding is that they're all supporting Lula in this election. Is that the case? And if that is the case, how did that happen?
Well, all except one that's relatively small, which is the CSB, which is now looks like they are supporting Ciro Gomes. But all the major labor confederations, which are the CUCI, the Força Sindical, and the UGT, which is usually a pluralist central, which usually doesn't take a political position, they are all supporting Lula. Because again, the unions have been so hard hit that they realize that the only way that they can have any kind of impact is getting, somebody a little bit more friendly in power. And obviously any continuation, any re-election of Bolsonaro will be absolutely tragic, not just for the unions, but for the entire Brazilian working class. I mean, we're looking at record unemployment, record levels of subemployment, which means people can't find jobs that give them the number of hours that they need to work in order to have an income to survive. I mean, just all the gains that were made under the PT government in terms of fighting poverty, et cetera, have all been completely rolled back. And so again, I think it's just, even though I think the unions, for example, don't have this expectation that Lula will bring the union tax back, but they know that they will have a seat at the table again under a Lula government. They'll even have a chance, they'll have a revamped labor ministry. Again, remember, Bolsonaro eliminated completely the labor ministry for the first 2.5 years of his administration. So there was no channel of institutional dialogue whatsoever. Union issues were divided up into the Justice Ministry, which at the time was Sergio Moro, not a labor fan. And then the other part of issues related to labor were in the Economics Ministry. Again, Paulo Guedes, never a friend of labor. So again, it's this expectation that, Lula will be able to open channels of dialogue, create institutional spaces. Again, Lula being sort of this master of social dialogue, by excellence, I think that's and he's been dialoguing with all the centrals individually. And so I think that's another reason why they've all been able to come together, or 90% in favor of the Lula candidacy, or pre-candidacy, we could say.
So, Jana, you worked in Sao Paulo with the Solidarity Center, which is linked to the AFL-CIO, the largest labor federation in the United States. I was a member of the AFL-CIO when I was a member of Service Employees International Union many years ago, and also the Communication Workers of America as a labor activist after I left Brazil and going back to the United States. What exactly is the Solidarity Center?
So the Solidarity Center, again, it's linked to the AFL-CIO, but has its own bylaws, and it's technically its own organization. It's the sort of labor solidarity, labor cooperation, how could we say it? International Cooperation Institute for the American labor movement. So the Solidarity Center has about 40 offices all around the world. In Latin America, in addition to Sao Paulo, they have offices in Bogota, Colombia, in Guatemala, in Mexico City, Lima, Peru. where they do work, they get funds, sometimes government funds, sometimes other private foundation funds or other resources to apply and do joint projects with, union partners, generally unions that are also affiliated to the International Confederation of Labor, to which the AFL-CIO is affiliated, which is the ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation. So, the main Brazilian centrals, UGT, CUT, Força, are all ITUC affiliates. So especially CUT, has this sort of historical relationship with the AFL-CIO. So they've been, a lot of our projects in terms of, our cooperation projects were with the CUT, working on strengthening women's empowerment in unions, fighting racial inequality at the workplace. And then we did obviously a very big project, which is very dear to my heart, with domestic workers and, trying to strengthen domestic worker unions. So those are just a sample of some of the projects we did. We also did projects looking at human rights and the legacy of the dictatorship and human rights abuses against unionists. We supported some of the work of the Comissão Nacional de Verdade. The CUT had its own commission, had its own special truth commission also. So yeah, we did a lot of interesting work, and because of that job, I was able to kind of live in my own skin that whole process of the decline of union rights and decline of democracy, because I was in that position from 2012, a relatively good time for unions, until the middle of the pandemic in 2020.
So when I was in Sao Paulo at the University of Sao Paulo doing my master's, I had chosen the topic of researching the American Institute for Free Labor Development, which was founded in 1961 in the midst of the Cold War, with strong support of the AFL-CIO. And its purpose at the time was to really fight against communist influence in the trade union movement. It was supported by multinationals who had large investments in Brazil, the US government, and likely CIA money. So I never finished my master's dissertation because I couldn't get access to any of the key people or the researcher, the documents. But many years later, one of my, a Brazilian student who came to Brown, Larissa Correa, did a book on this topic. So we all know that the US government was involved in the 1964 coup, helped overthrow it, and probably some of these labor figures, they at least boasted that they were involved in the coup's success in 1964. So what was it like for you as a progressive, pro-socialist North American working with an institution in which had a history in its past being involved in undemocratic measures? How did you negotiate that, or how did the Solidarity Center negotiate that history?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say I would start off, the sort of the foreign policy of the AFL-CIO sort of has a before and after. The point which marked the difference was 1995, when with the election of John Sweeney on the reform slate, defeating sort of these old guard, very sort of rooted in Cold War politics leadership, that came before. And after that, it was, I believe in 1998 is when the new version of their foreign policy body, which is now called the Solidarity Center, kind of was formally constituted with new bylaws, with a new, board of directors, new, not entirely new staff, but mostly new staff. That's where, the new staff came on board, for example, in the Brazil office, it changed names, everything. And, as a progressive, kind of there was a sort of cleaning of the slate, understanding that, it is important to have American unionists on the ground, working side by side to assist our union brothers and sisters. The union movement, by definition, believes in international solidarity, and it's a practice that the union movement has lived since its inception in the in the 19th century. So I think it is very important for American labor, which can have access to resources, financial resources, power resources, even their own connections with multinational enterprises, for example, to help our brothers and sisters in the global South. And, in my case in Brazil, I kind of reasoned, if the Solidarity Center isn't using some of this money, which is basically taxpayer money, it could get used for much worse purposes, So I feel like, the institution, although it is a legacy, I think there's a legacy that the American labor movement should still recognize, and think about, is there ways of reparations, for example. I think in my own head, the one way of kind of working towards that form of reparations is doing projects, for example, on human rights with our Brazilian counterparts. So that's how I kind of justified it,
Yeah, and it's also really important to point out that in 1981, Lula was indicted under the National Security Act during the dictatorship. And there was a huge outpouring of support among the labor movement in the United States. Lula came to the United States and met with the AFL-CIO in Washington, D.C., and built strong links with people like Stan Gasek, who's also a member of the Washington, Brazil office, and others. And so that really shifted. And part of that, in my mind, had to do with the fact that in the 80s in the United States, a lot of young ex-students like yourself went into the labor movement. Many of them were involved in Central American Solidarity or South African anti-apartheid work. And that kind of changed the tone of the labor movement in the United States. So I can see that shift, and I can see the part of that you have been involved in. So tell us a little bit more about your research and your work with domestic workers in Brazil. That's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, well, so sort of the way I got involved in the topic was, again, it was, we had the possibility at Solidarity Center of getting some specific resources to do a large project. It was never a sector I'd really engaged with very much. But, once I started getting to know more about it, I just, got really fascinated because, again, the domestic work, just like farm work in Brazil is a direct, legacy of slavery, the way that, the domestic workers were excluded from all or almost all of, the vast majority of labor protections. They were not included in the 1943 labor code, that was written by Getúlio Vargas, which was progressive for its time. They only gradually started getting a few labor protections here and there. Ironically, that first started under the military dictatorship in the 1970s. But then it wasn't until then they were allowed to finally form unions, because before then they could only form associations. They were allowed to form unions starting with the Constitution of 1988. So you have the first official domestic worker unions forming then, even though, again, before you have this whole history of domestic worker associations that go back to the late 1930s. The first one was formed in the city of Santos by an activist called Laudelina de Campos Melo, who was actually also a member of the Communist Party, a very amazing individual, who stayed involved with the domestic worker union movement for entire life, Anyway, so you have these unions starting to form, and then they start working together. They take advantage of this, again, this political opening that happens, during the PT governments, to win some really impressive legislation, which almost, 90% now they have the same rights as any other private worker. And that's basically, in the case of Brazil, as you probably know, that's pretty revolutionary. You're talking about 6 million, 6 million workers, a huge, Brazil has the largest amount of domestic workers in the world outside of India. 94% of them are women, close to 63% are Afro-Brazilian. And even with these labor protections, you still have, less than 50% actually earn at least the minimum wage. Only 40% contribute or are covered under the Social Security system of Brazil. So again, you have the most vulnerable population, sort of the real base of the pyramid, base of the labor market pyramid. But at the same time, you have these women, these Black women with low levels of education who've, really experienced enormous difficulties in their life, doing amazing organizing that some of these traditional unions are not capable of doing, and these are workers, again, they have little or no free time. They have no paid staff for their unions. They don't even have, most of them don't even have their own offices. They rely on like church basements to be able to meet in places like that. But at the same time, they've been able to really empower and dignify, so many domestic workers around the country. And I really it's really been an amazingly gratifying experience to, be able to share and support their struggle and learn from their experiences.
One of the things that I think our viewers and listeners who might not know Brazil as well as you do is that every middle-class family had at least one domestic worker, a maid, if not more. And today they certainly have at least a cleaning lady coming in several days a week, or a cook. But this was the basis of labor, of domestic labor in the United States, in Brazil, in the household was this massive numbers of people. So what were the kinds of specific changes that happened with the new labor legislation as a result of the organizing of domestic workers?
So first of all, you had to start paying domestic workers overtime. They had to have by law, one full day off. They had to get they had to get extra overtime, for example, to work Sundays and holidays. They were finally allowed to collect unemployment insurance, and even today they don't collect as many months of unemployment insurance as other private sector workers, but it's still something, right? They also get certain other benefits like the FGTS, which is another benefit that you receive if you're unemployed or if you want to use it for, to purchase housing, things like that. And so basically, again, it's just that, it was the possibility for workers to come in and, be able to look their employer eye to eye and say, we have the same rights. Because again, like you just said, most people who employ domestic workers in Brazil are not super rich people like they are in the United States, who have, live-in maids. But, like you said, almost every middle-class family has a domestic worker. I myself, with my son, we had an amazing nanny who I also like to say, became a union activist and now is a leader of the Sao Paulo domestic worker unions. So again, it's this idea of like equality, dignity, like people really, you get more workers are now, they can have maternity leave, they have protections against firing, if they get pregnant, and then there's a specific case, the city of Sao Paulo, the domestic worker union in Sao Paulo actually has a collective bargaining agreement, which they've been able to negotiate and sign since 2016, which gives additional protections. They have a minimum wage, the wage floor is higher than the national minimum wage. They get other kinds of benefits in terms of access to insurance and other kinds of social programs. And they have a very interesting clause also for immigrant domestic workers, because Sao Paulo has been more and more, you've seen, it used to be that you get a lot of immigrants from other parts of Brazil going to Sao Paulo to work. Nowadays, you actually have international immigrants, whether it's from, other South American countries like Bolivia or Peru, or also now you have from Haiti, from Portuguese-speaking African countries like Angola, and sort of the high-level, domestic workers, nannies. You have now an influx of domestic workers from Philippines, because you have this tendency among the elite to want to have nannies that speak English. And so now there's been this whole, wave of Filipino domestic workers coming in, obviously, in there. And so basically now the Sao Paulo domestic worker unions have been they have specific organizing campaigns for immigrant domestic workers, in their languages also. And they have a clause which guarantees, equality of rights for, Brazilian-born domestic workers as well as their immigrant counterparts, and gives immigrant workers paid time off if they need to go and, deal with things related to their migration status. So those are some of a few of the sort of big advances both the Sao Paulo Union and the workers in general have been able to achieve.
When I traveled with Jima Josefi on a tour in the United States in 2017, she told me the story that one of the underlying really strong negative sentiments towards her government was the fact that under her government, they signed additional labor laws to protect domestic workers. And many, many people of the upper class and the upper middle class, and even the middle class, were very angry because they really had lost the equivalent of contemporary slavery or slave labor in their homes, and they had to pay people a decent wage and rights. And it really angered these wealthy women or wealthy families that kind of lost that privilege to the labor organizing. So I understand you're organizing a delegation of people from the Democratic Socialists of America to Brazil. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so, again, DSA is an organization. It's the largest left-wing organization in the United States. We have close to 100,000 dues-paying members. The vast majority of our members are very young, their 20s and 30s, many people who were inspired to become active in politics with the Bernie Sanders pre-campaigns in 2016 and 2020. And so we feel like we have a lot to learn from our counterparts in Brazil, especially the PT. We've been developing relationships with the PT International Relations Secretary and other PT members, and they invited us to come. It was originally supposed to be earlier in the year, but then there was the whole Omicron business, and we decided to kind of push it off. And we're going to be there for May Day, and so it'll be really exciting. It'll be the first in-person May Day since 2019, since the last 2 years there's been a pandemic. So it's just going to be a great opportunity to be able to meet and learn from not just the PT, but we're also going to meet with members, leaders of PSOL, with Brazilian social movements, obviously the labor movement, with the MTST, the homeless workers movement. Learn a little bit about that human rights history. We're going to meet with some people who are now activists around the issue of truth, memory, and reparations. We're going to visit the Memorial da Resistência, which is the former prison of the secret police, the DOPS in Sao Paulo. So I think it's going to be, a great experience to take a bunch of leading members of DSA. Some of our members who hold elected office will also be coming. To learn from our colleagues in the Global South, and also to be able to have a dialogue about that with them, about how we as activists in the United States, what we can do to help protect and preserve Brazilian democracy as we go into this electoral season. As you know very well, and many of us know, the US unfortunately played a negative role in the, vis-a-vis the Lava Jato operation, in terms of getting, in terms of the Lula's imprisonment, in terms of, obviously Lula not being able to run as a candidate in 2018. And so we feel like we have a moral obligation, a political obligation also to work with our political partners in Brazil to try to ensure that that does not happen again this year.
So the president, the outgoing president of the Brazilian Electoral Court has called on the European Union to send representatives to observe the October 2nd, October 30th elections this year. Is DSA thinking of joining others in being international observers?
Probably. I mean, again, DSA, I think our role, we're not impartial election observers, like an Organization of American States or et cetera, or the Carter Center. The idea is we want to be there on the ground to give political accompaniment to our partners, especially the PT. In October during the elections. I'm sure we will have some presence during the elections. We're going to be discussing that during our visit. I'm sure that's going to be in conjunction with, other left-wing parties that are part of the Foro de Sao Paulo, because again, we have a working relationship now with the Foro de Sao Paulo as well. So yeah, we definitely understand the importance of being on the ground, just like, and this is something that we've been starting to do as DSA. Last year, we accompanied the Peruvian elections. We accompanied the elections in Chile. We accompanied the Venezuelan municipal elections that were also happening in November. And we also had some DSA leaders accompany the first round of the Colombian elections just last month. So that's absolutely something we're going to be doing.
So any other thing that you'd like to share with us about your experiences in Brazil, a message to the listeners of this podcast, this YouTube program?
Yeah, that's, well, like I said, I think, again, the US, for those of us who've been doing, sort of general Latin American solidarity activism for many, many years, it really never ceases to amaze me how much, for good or for bad, the US has such an influence. Even in a country like Brazil, which is, not the same as a Colombia or Guatemala, has a strong economy, is its kind of own, sort of, sub-regional hegemonic, sort of geopolitical power. But, what we can do just by being aware of what's going on in Brazil, being able to mobilize, whether it's, pressing our members of Congress to sign on to a letter, whether it's participating in a speak out or a protest. I think it's so valuable. It gets picked up, as it gets picked up in Brazilian media. The Brazilian community in the United States, which is not small, which is 1.4 million people, also can see that support. So I think it's really important what we do as U.S.-based activists to help protect what used to be such a vibrant and exciting democracy in a beautiful country with beautiful people.
Thank you so much, Jana, for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks. Mine too. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed the interview. Brazil Unfiltered is part of the Democracy Observatory and supported by the Washington Brazil office. If you missed our live broadcast of Dialogues for Democracy, in which experts talked about the integrity of the Brazilian elections, you can find the video of the event on this channel. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a 5-star review to help other people find the program. Until next time, até a próxima.